Providing education on sustainable agriculture will place women at the center of local solutions to combating climate change. Many women in rural Côte d'Ivoire work in the fields. A challenge they face is land desertification. Over the past decades, rising temperatures have led to drying crops and reduced productivity. Teaching rural women about the benefits of land preservation practices like farmer-managed natural regeneration or encouraging regional methods like Vesile will contribute to reviving the soils with nutrients and significantly slow down the desertification process. In Côte d'Ivoire, 80% of the soil has low native fertility and requires the use of special techniques to become agriculturally productive. Thus, good environmental education in how to apply these techniques in rural areas is necessary to slow down desertification and will improve harvests.
From a Kenyan perspective, the missing voice in addressing climate change is that of rural women. Government and NGOs should spread the climate conversation beyond elitist circles and bring it to rural dwellers, and particularly women, for three reasons. Rural women who bear the brand of the climate crisis appreciate its urgency. Secondly, they feed and sustain the nation through subsistence farming, making their exclusion damaging to their livelihoods and their children and society at large. Finally, the climate struggle needs more voices, and Kenyan women such as Nobel winner Wangari Maathai have demonstrated great leadership and a social conscience in addressing climate change, affirming that they are a potent force in these struggles. Governments should bring rural women on board through empowerment, through protection and support, a move that will see them rise from being among the most affected victims to being the most formidable warriors for responsible change.
Climate change, for all its repercussions, at least doesn't discriminate between men and women, right? Wrong. Women worldwide are much more likely to be negatively impacted by climate change as compared to men. Yet, they have almost no power, influence, or voice in the matter. Women worldwide need a voice to show how this man-made problem has a feminist solution. I believe that a documentary series documenting the struggles of these women who are on the front lines of this crisis is the fastest and most efficient way of spreading the word. We need to hear from these women and know what can be done to provide immediate relief as well as long-term solutions to the problem of climate change. Streaming services like Netflix have millions of subscribers worldwide, including world leaders. So putting such a documentary on Netflix would make sure that world leaders hear directly from these women, who will then become a part of the global dialogue on climate change.
Wow, that was extremely powerful. Thank you all for joining us this morning for this panel on taking a look at rethinking the planet and looking at climate through a gender lens, and specifically a feminine lens. And I'm Liz Alderman, European economics correspondent with the New York Times, and I'm really excited to have a distinguished panel with me this morning to discuss this. But first I want to say, I was going to open up with a question to our panel about asking them to sort of explain why it is that gender is so important when it comes to making climate change policy, but you guys did that just now in a very stark and illustrative way. Nonetheless, this is going to be the focus of our panel, and I would like to welcome Kim Campbell, the former Prime Minister of Canada and a member of the Club de Madrid, Shivi Dwivedi, I'm pronouncing it in the French way. You are the leader of the youth engagement strategy at the UN of the UN Climate Change Champions, and Claudia Chwalisz, you're the founder of DemocracyNext, and you've been working to shift political and legislative power to everyday people. And I just wanted to say something that Paula Coelho, the Environment Minister from Angola, was supposed to be with us this morning, and unfortunately she wasn't able to come due to some issues with the cabinet back home, but she and I had a fairly long conversation about the issue that all of you just described in this video, about why it is that women, particularly in the global south, are on the front lines and impacted by climate change. so starkly. That all being said, Kim, let me sort of, start with you. I mean, obviously, this morning you went to your tap, I went to my tap, we all turned on the tap, we poured ourselves a glass of water, we took a shower. We didn't really have to think twice about that. But the fact of the matter is that this simple gesture is inaccessible to millions of people around the world, and particularly in the global south. And Kim, I mean, you've been working on this issue for a long time. Maybe you could sort of talk from your perspective about why the issue of gender in climate change is so important. Why is it such a big deal? And how can giving women more of a seat at the decision-making table make a difference? Yeah, put your light on.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here. And I know the sound is quite echoey here, so I will try not to speak at my usual rapid speak. I'll try to speak more slowly. I think a good way to start is to draw an analogy with what we've learned about the role of women in peace and security and peace negotiations. The reason for the involvement of women is to have good results, to have good policies that reflect the reality of life as it is lived by at least half the population. I served on the board of the crisis group for a number of years, and Don Steinberg, who was the vice chair, had been an assistant secretary of state in the United States during some peace negotiations. And he was very proud of a negotiation he'd helped to resolve or engage in an African country, I won't say which. And he cries when he tells his story because he said, and I even came out and said the agreement was gender neutral. But he said 40 men sat around a table and came up with the agreement. And incidentally, it involved giving amnesty for sexual crimes. So 40 men forgave other men for bad behavior. But the important thing was that the agreement fell apart because there were no women to describe what was actually necessary. When you demined, you needed to demine not just the roads, you needed to demine the fields where people worked. You needed to have a policy for how women who'd been involved with the rebels could return to their communities. There were dozens of questions that had not been answered. The happy outcome of that failure is that the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions that require that peace negotiations include women. And we need the same kind of global commitment and resolution that all processes to deal with and plan responses to climate change, whether it's adaptation or mitigation, that women be at the table. It's not to be nice to the ladies, it's to get the best possible result. The reality of life as women live it is the life of humanity. And if we do not listen to the reality of life as women live it, we will have failure. And so I think I want to just stop there and say, we do it because we must, and if we don't do it, we're really stupid.
Right on. Shivi, you lead the youth engagement strategy, again, at the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions. You've said, when we were talking earlier, that growing up as a woman in India, you see clearly how gender, and social equity and climate change are all linked. Explain what you mean by that. And if women are most affected by this, what is it that is blocking them from having more of a voice?
So I grew up in a city called Lucknow, which is the capital of the most populated state in India, which is, if some of you have been, it's Uttar Pradesh. It's got the worst statistics as well in terms of crime and all of that. But, just, Liz, as you said, in the morning you opened your faucet and, we had access to water. So at home, we can do the same, but we are given water supply at 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. But I come from a relatively privileged place where we do have tanks which we fill up, when we get this water supply in the morning, so that when I wake up, I have water running in my faucets. But if it runs out and if I've consumed more than I should, then you've got to wait for the next few hours for the water supply to come back. But that is my reality, which is very different from the reality of women who are in the rural population, which is 65% of India's population. And I was reading, it's supposed to go up to 70% in the next 1 year. And the reality of what happens on ground in rural communities is not the same, where they do not have the privilege to fill water in tanks. They're living in these shanties, in these slums, where they've got to walk a couple of kilometers every day to fill water and then carry it back. Now, in a day when, if you've run out of water and you're like, okay, we need to do the water run, is it the man who's going to step away from earning, going for the job or earning a daily wage? Or is it the women who's got to step back and take charge of making sure that there's water to cook and clean and all of that? And this is not just prevalent to women in the society. Even the kids have to support in all of this. And then it's the girl child further who's pulled out of school because the boy needs to go to school to access education to earn a livelihood, whereas the girl will get married. So this is how deeply rooted the patriarchal society is in India, and the impact of climate change, where you see global warming. So first, if somebody was walking 5 kilometers to a catchment area for water, with droughts coming up, you've got to walk 10 kilometers. So right now, that is even an option. But with extreme heat and flooding and everything that's coming along with global warming, there might not be enough water. So
what you're describing actually sounds like it's really exacerbating gender inequality even more.
It is. And when we talk about, extreme weather events, so if, there's loss of livestock because there's no water, there's loss of agricultural land because you can't till, there's no water, it leads to migration. And when you're migrating as well, again, it's easy. When you're coming into city, it's so expensive for those families to afford. So it's the man who moves, and they've left the women and the children behind. And they still are in those same conditions. So, they send some money back, which helps them access, but the issues remain the same. So their condition does not change. And in fact, then it's leading more to child marriages again, because you've got to unburden the financial load on a family. It's leading to trafficking, because people are desperate on ground on how do you survive. So it's a bit dark, and that is the reality of, I'm talking about India, but it's a reality of a majority of Global South. And the young person from Kenya was talking about the same thing, that women are leading on subsistence farming, and that is the way they support the livelihood or run the house. But that's going to change, and is changing already.
Thank you for that. And Claudia, I mean, this is sort of a great segue to you. You talk about shifting power to people from citizens' forums. How effective do you think that can be to help address this situation, particularly outside of Europe, where, as we just heard Shivi talk about, the gender roles are highly entrenched, and indeed, as we've seen, sort of exacerbated by climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important question, and this is why I feel honored that you even asked me onto this panel, because as you all are aware, I'm not the Angolan minister, so I'm quite humble in speaking from a quite different perspective on these issues of climate and gender. But I think that it's about taking this step back, and everything that Shivi was just talking about. Climate change is exacerbating these problems, but actually the problems themselves are much more structural and much more about the inequalities that have been entrenched by these systems where women are just not at the decision-making table. I keep hearing through some of the videos and in these discussions about we need to find ways to give women a voice. And it's not just about a voice, it's about how do we actually make the structural changes happen so that women have power and are equally taking decisions at the decision-making table. And it's not just about creating better participation processes that, okay, what do women think or what are their experiences? And then it's the people who are always deciding, who are mostly men, who are taking the decisions at the end of the day. And this is why the focus of the work that I'm doing on is thinking about, yes, perhaps for the longer term, but what are these structural changes that we could be advocating for in our governance structures that move us away from oligarchic forms of decision-making, which are either through elections or through appointment on a lot of these UN bodies and elsewhere, to getting more democratic methods of bringing in genuinely representative portions of the population to be deciding together about their own destiny collectively.
Kim, I mean, as a veteran policymaker, how realistic, is that? How easy is that to do today? I mean, at COP 26 last year, it was sort of, they had written in a kind of an amendment that, gender does need to play a part in climate deliberations. But, are we, how much farther, do we have to go? How do we actually get there? How do we make this a reality?
Two things I would say, that countries who have good mechanisms for engaging women need to share them. I belong to a wonderful organization called the Club de Madrid, and some of my fellow members are here. We're the largest forum of former democratically elected presidents and prime ministers, and we're deeply committed to democratic values. And we have a project called the Shared Societies Project, because over 90% of the countries of the world have minorities of at least 10%. And we've put together a toolkit of what countries can do and share their insights. Canada has a gender-based foreign policy. There are a lot of things that we do. So countries that have made these commitments sometimes have the nuts and bolts ideas, how you take the idea and turn it into a program or a practice. The other thing I would say is that gender issues are cultural. And just as we looked at that picture of the academy here and all the men, at the same time that all those men were meeting, there was a culture right near here in the area of Tuscany in Italy, the Etruscans, and I live in Tuscany. And the Etruscans, their language has not survived, and which is sad, but what we know about them, we know about the people who traded with them, including the Greeks, who were horrified by the Etruscans. Why were they horrified by the Etruscans? Because Etruscan society was characterized by a very high level of gender equality. And you can find wonderful old sarcophagus covers that demonstrate the companionate marriage model that Etruscans had, of husbands and wives being equal, and women who were literate. The point I want to make is gender relations are cultural. And everything we do that expresses our confidence in women, the importance of educating women, putting women in positions of authority, helps to convey a cultural value that percolates out. The current Prime Minister of Canada, who is not my party, I might add, appointed a gender-balanced cabinet when he was first elected. He was actually the 5th leader in the world to do this. He wasn't the first. But he said that when on one of his first overseas visits, another leader said to him, "Why did you appoint cabinet 50-50 women? Why didn't you just appoint on merit?" And he said, "If I'd appointed on merit, I'd have had more women."
I mean, that being said, Shivi, I think you presented a statistic when we were talking earlier this morning that still the fact of the matter is that 70% of the policymaking roles for climate change on a global scale are basically, still made up of men. And indeed, I mean, climate change does impact all of humanity. But that being said, I mean, what is it that is lacking, in your view, from climate policy right now as a result of this imbalance?
I mean, Kim said it as well. It's the gender lens which is missing, and the gender lens is missing because the gender is not represented in the room that is taking the decisions. And there's a historical reason of why they're not able to get there. And Kim said about merit, but in a lot of developing countries, maybe there aren't enough women who kind of have the credentials to show up in the space and challenge men in the same manner because they've not had access, they've not had those kind of opportunities. So it is starting ground up in a way around education, where you do allow more women, and I take the word allow back because that is the worst word you grow up with, where you feel you need to be allowed to do something, and that is the first step of breaking the barrier, where they can take charge, they can realize their own agency of accessing what they'd like to do with their lives. And I think as somebody who's very much still living in India and a Global South resident, I found my agency much later in life, where, I'm in awe of Greta at 15, feeling like she can go there and protest, but I wouldn't have been, at the age of 15, be able to even think that that was something I could approach. So there's something about creating the spaces for women, for young people in countries to find their agency, to really be the decision makers of how they want to shape their future. Where do they want to go? So somebody asked me, how did you get into environment? I said I was always passionate about it, but didn't know I had a way to, be of influence or use my platform or use my voice in a meaningful way. And it has taken me 30 plus years on this journey to be at a space like this now, where it is very different, say, where in a country which has free education or makes sure that women are equally in education, where girls are, in equal numbers or more as compared to boys, where families don't have to think which gender do they send to school to support, their future livelihood. So I think this is something so fundamental, where it's around making women or, the girl child feel safe to access, dreams or possibilities that they'd like to. And that is how they would show up in the spaces where these decisions are being made.
And I mean, Claudia, what would your thoughts be about how to create those spaces, those types of spaces for?
Yeah, and I mean, I really recognize that the challenges are quite different of how do we get there in Global South and Global North, and from everything you're describing, it's just such a different experience from the context that I'm used to working in. I mean, before the work I'm doing now, I was at the OECD, and this has also been shaping my perspective on this. These are the interactions that I've been used to having. So I feel like I don't almost have the legitimacy to be claiming of how do we get there in Global South countries. I think we need to be thinking about this, but I don't know is the quite honest answer, because I think those culturally entrenched gender, I don't even know what the word I'm looking for is, but it's a completely different starting point. Whereas I think in Global North, more generally, we still have a lot of the same problems culturally, but I think we have a different starting point where, at least in the schools, it is everybody who is going there. And I think some of the ways do start much earlier. So for those of you who were here yesterday in the opening provocation, where I was putting us 10 years in the future and thinking about all the different ways we might be actually governing ourselves differently, it wasn't just about the main institutions of government, it was also thinking about how in the schools from a young age we can be bringing in these democratic principles of having randomly selected student councils, where people are taking turns representing and being represented, having the experience of the democratic practice of deliberation, of listening to others, of deciding together. And of course, that implies having that representation of this being already from that young age, you're equally deciding amongst genders, but also across other sorts of dividing lines. So I think we need to be thinking about this across institutions, in our workplaces, in our banks, in our universities, and all sorts of other institutions that have an influence on our public life. How could we be changing the governance so that it is something that becomes normal as well? Because one of the other things is that we're talking here through the lens of climate, but of course climate is also one of these quite all-encompassing and multidisciplinary things, where housing policy, water policy, energy policy, infrastructure, mobility, all of these things have a climate lens to them. But at the moment, those sorts of decisions are being taken, in our main institutions of government, in our parliaments and in our senates by ministers, and we're so far from having proper representation of society in those decision-making spaces today. We saw the picture in the previous panel about, okay, there were no men in the photo. If you pulled up the picture of most parliaments today, Most of them have some women, but they're so far away from parity. So I think we need to be completely rethinking and trying to move towards actually having the more democratic ways of choosing our decision makers. And that's where I come back to the provocation of challenging the fact that we're in election-based systems, which by their very nature, as the ancient Greeks had said, end up leading to polarization and to very narrow few actually having decision-making power. Now, of course, we're not taking all the elements of it. If we reflect back, it's not just the men who need to have that, but yeah, I think it really goes, like at the heart of all of this is this bigger picture about how do we change our systems of governance in a way that we could be really shifting political, but also legislative power to everyday people in a way that that group then represents society. We're very far from it today.
I see you nodding your head. I mean, how easy do you think that would be to pull off?
I mean, I wish it's easy and I wish it happens, but we are in a space where, you know, with the whole energy crisis and with all of us moving towards a net zero goal, we are in, I mean, most of the countries are in spaces where that, you know, really looking at policy restructuring or kind of really exploring these transitions from fossil fuels to green energy. And there's something called a concept of just transition, which I'm sure all of you are aware of, but how do you not leave anybody behind in this transition? And I think that is a great space for, you know, our decision makers, for our policy makers to really explore how are you really including women in this and how are they not getting left behind. Historically we have, but this is the time where we're reshaping everything. This is the time where this is a new crisis that's on us around global warming and climate change. So how do you really ensure that women are not left behind in this transition that is happening? And when I talk about women, of course, we feel it. At having a privileged background and having a space to share this, feel the discrimination too in spaces, but it's unimaginable for those, you know, who don't even think that they can have a seat at the table or who are at the front line facing the worst calamities. But so yeah.
Kim, do you have a solution to that before we turn it to the audience and open it up for questions? Because I know there are a lot of questions from you all.
I don't have a solution except the need to be persistent in delivering the message and also to understand that a lot of our allies are men, that men are often equally committed to engaging women because they get it. And I always say that it's not a case of men versus women. It's the women and men who get it working to persuade the women and men who don't get it. So I think that's a really important point. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. That is a very important point. We're going to open it up to questions now. Please raise your hand so that we can bring you the microphone. And if you wouldn't mind keeping your questions brief and saying to whom you would like them addressed. Yes, please.
Hello. I would like this addressed to Ms. Shivi. So as you mentioned earlier, in the Global South and other patriarchal societies, and perhaps ones that are not as democratic, women's education does not go as far as education available as men. And as a result, their involvement is low. So my question is, how do you suggest we increase women's engagements in politics if environmental education is not accessible to them in the first place? How do we, the everyday citizens, create those spaces and make those structural changes? Thank you.
So there's a huge ask around climate education. If any of you follow the Conference of Parties, you know, the COPs every year. Last year, a big article under negotiation was around action for climate empowerment. And what that includes is how do all nations in their NDCs, which is the nationally determined contributions, what are you including around educating the entire, you know, the citizens around climate change? How are you building the capacity for them to be able to tackle? So there is an effort that is being taken from an organization, from a global level, to ensure that it is mandated for all countries to explore and, you know, have a deadline for what you're trying to do. So that is one. just from an India perspective, a couple of years ago, environmental education did come into our board. We have these massive country-level exams for standard 10th and 12th, and they did include environmental education. So it's starting now, but it needs to start much younger. And also just linked to this, yesterday we were in this workshop which was around youth, and we were doing a democracy cafe. And it was a learning for me that India is one of the few countries in the room that were present who include civic education, where we are told what a political system is and what is the role of the prime minister, how do the elections take place. And so while this is there, and it gives people a sense of how the country runs and might inspire some people to do so, for further education which teaches you around policy, there's a brain drain. A lot of them are going to those who can afford to the Harvards, and because that is where you really get a global sense. But we are lacking quality education. While there is education, there's still lack of quality education, at least in my country, which ensures meaningful pathway for people to get into local politics.
Terrific. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. So my name is Btisam Borhanan, and I'm from Akhawan University in Tehran, and I'm presenting Global Liberal Arts Alliance. So my question is about sort of the prototyping of certain climate policies to other countries, from other countries. So let's say we want to actually import certain climate and environmental policies to some countries who lack those. How can we ensure the protection of women and citizens in certain countries where citizens cannot, for example, speak their mind or talk about certain opposition thoughts, or women actually cannot have the mic to speak, or do not have a place in the table? Because we are witnessing in certain countries, women are actually attacked physically and in a lot of ways attacked when they are speaking their mind. So how can we actually protect them? Because this projection method was seen to be very unuseful. Or do you think we should tailor these programs to fit other countries in a more considerate way? Thank you.
That's a really excellent and important question. Kim, is that something you can address?
Well, it is hard, and I think women have to find allies, but they have to have solidarity among themselves to be able to share protection. But in many societies, there are men who will be supportive and can help, but also global norms that recognize the importance of women. As I said, Resolution 1325 of the Security Council, which required women to be part of negotiations in peace and security. The UN can do similar things to require, as part of the delivery of programs, that women be involved. It's not an easy answer, but I think the key is to create a global cultural norm of the naturalness and importance of women's involvement. As I say, you don't do it as a favor, you do it because it's part of your desire for success. And to work in every society to find the allies who can help to create the safe spaces for women to do that. I know with the Club of Madrid, we've done missions where our members come to provide support. So if the former Prime Minister of Norway or the President of Colombia or something, a man comes and is making it very clear that he is supporting programs that empower women, that can also often be a powerful message to the men in that society, that this is in fact a global norm that is not something that excludes men, but that actually men should embrace because they care about strong societies. But I'm sorry, I don't have an easy answer, but the persistence in this way I think is most important.
All right, thank you. John?
So I'm going to ask Claudia a question, which is, what's your favourite example of where this is already happening on this issue, this idea of bringing sortition and random selection to bear? But just to share, while you think about what you're going to answer with, I wanted to just bring into the room the fact that it's not perfect and in any way, but there has actually been in the run-up to COP last year, a thing called the Global Assembly, which managed to select using NASA technology 100 randomly selected people at random selected places on the world, including in rural India, and bring them together to deliberate on these issues. So there have been some experiments in this direction, but I want to know what Claudia's favourite is.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, actually, because it makes me think that I should have mentioned the fact that part of my entry point into the thinking about this is that there have been, especially in the past few years, over 50 climate citizens' assemblies that have taken place in different places at different levels of government. I think there's 13 at the national level. So I mentioned the Citizens' Climate Convention in France, but there's also been ones in Denmark and Spain and UK and other places. But what I think is the most exciting and interesting kind of approach to this is the one that is about to be tried. So I can't speak to how it will work in practice, but actually I think part of the downside of trying to do just a one-off Citizens' Climate Assembly goes to a point I was trying to make earlier about climate is not just one issue, and it's not as though in one moment in time it's enough for citizens to be involved in the decision-making around this. So how do we get to that next step of making systemic changes so that citizens are involved on climate-related policy decision-making on an ongoing basis all the time? And it's not public yet, but there's a European capital city which is about to announce the fact that it is going to implement a permanent citizens' climate assembly where people living in this city, not just nationals of that country, but people living there, will all have the right to be randomly selected and be taking turns in this group of 100 people. And their mandate will relate to different policy questions that relate to climate change, that relate to more of that really difficult how political question. So a lot of the targets, a lot of the big decisions are already set at COP, then decided at the EU level and then national level and so on. But there's a lot of really tricky political questions of like, okay, but how are we actually going to get every single home insulated in the next 5 years? What needs to happen for that to be possible? So involving citizens in the decision-making around those sorts of issues and having this integrated into the already existing institutional complex that exists to make sure that this can actually then be implemented, I think is a really interesting and exciting development that shows us that actually it's possible to start integrating genuinely democratic institutions that bring together everyday citizens in a meaningful way to be shaping climate-related decisions. So look out for the announcement of this in early November.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Claudia.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there is a consensus that women across the world are still struggling to secure their right place in the world, but some more than others. So there is the argument that women in the global north have more opportunities than, say, women in the global south. And part of this is because countries in the global north have had the opportunity to use policies or means that are not climate friendly to create opportunities for their women. And so countries in the global south make the argument, we also want to create these opportunities for our women, and we want to use the same ways you used, which are not very environment friendly, but countries in the global north push back and say, no, you cannot do that. So how do we reconcile this? Thank you.
That's a totally fair question. And by the way, thank you very much for your presentation in the video. It was really stark and revealing, and it was what we really needed to hear. So thank you for that. Shivi, I'm going to let you take that. It's going to be the last question because we run out of time.
I'll just leave it. I think there's a huge movement around climate justice, which responds and has similar questions around what you asked, where, the whole conversation between developed and developing countries. But we're also seeing the effects now. So somewhere, I think we're okay that we need to transition in a way where we might not have the same opportunities as the developed countries. And that is the reality, and that is the truth of the matter. So you'll be learning to accept it a little bit, where you just kind of make peace with it. But it is around, like I said, it is just transition, where even in this transition, there's a lot more that can happen. There are lots of steps that can be taken to ensure that even women are developing or have the same opportunities or almost same opportunities in the global south. And I'm really hoping that our leaders who are in the decision-making or in the policy space have a similar perspective and have enough information to support them as they're taking these decisions.
Well, thank you. And actually, I said that you would be the last person I'd call on, but Kim, if you don't mind, just to follow up on a kind of a core issue that was just asked in that question, how do we I mean, there is a concern that basically countries in the global north have certainly, obviously, a stronger position at the bargaining table than those in the global south. Do you have thoughts on how to address, that imbalance and to create more fairness going forward?
Well, I think this is no time for us to colonize an issue. I think the countries of the global north have been the major emitters, and we have a huge moral responsibility to do as much as we can to assist the countries who are bearing the brunt of climate change. And I think that the negotiations and discussions and policy development will only succeed if there is a humility. And it's not just a humility because of moral obligation, but it's also humility that comes from intelligently understanding the capacities of other countries to solve their own problems if they have an opportunity to do that, and not to get in the way and not to set unrealistic barriers or expectations. My experience in working with people in the global south is just the richness of human capital and smarts and ability, and how people, often with very little resources, do magnificent and amazing things. So we need to get out of the way, but we also need to understand our moral obligation to support where we can and provide resources where we can. And I hope that these conversations and policy developments will be conducted and will continue to be conducted with that respect and with that understanding that, I'm not, I'm from the global north, I'm here to help you. No, get away. I'm from the global north and I'm a privileged person. How can I help you? Tell me what you need and let us pay our debt to you by making it possible for you to solve the problems that are in your part of the world. That's the attitude we need to have.
Thank you. That was a very powerful way to end.